Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. We're going to be getting into some pretty dense stuff today.
Cool.
Vivek Ramaswamy's Nation of Truths. It's creating quite a stir right now, and with the election coming up next year, we thought, hey, let's really break down what he's saying.
Yeah, it's definitely a book that makes you think. That's for sure.
Yeah.
10 truths, he calls them. And honestly, some of them are kind of in your face, you know.
But he doesn't pull any punches, that's for sure. We're talking about faith, climate change, gender, race, all this stuff that could really get people riled up.
And that's, I think, exactly why we need to be talking about it. We're not here to tell anyone what to think, but to just lay out what Ramaswamy's saying, give it some context, and hopefully, get people thinking a little more deeply about these issues.
Absolutely. So let's just dive right in, shall we?
Yeah.
He starts off with two truths that at first glance don't seem related at all. God is real, and the climate change agenda is a hoax. Now, before anyone jumps down my throat, he's not saying the climate isn't changing. It's more about like the narrative around it and the policies being pushed, that kind of thing.
Right, and what I find interesting is how he connects those two ideas back to his own journey back to faith. He talks about how falling in love with his wife really kind of shook up his whole worldview. He'd been like a pretty staunch atheist, and then suddenly he was wrestling with these big existential questions that science alone just couldn't answer. Have you ever experienced something that just completely shifted your perspective, made you question everything you thought you knew?
Oh, totally. I mean, have you ever just looked up at the night sky and it's like completely clear, you see all those stars, it just hits you how much is really out there, how much we don't understand. And that's where Ramaswamy brings in those classic arguments for God's existence, like the fine-tuning of the universe. The idea that the laws of physics are so perfectly calibrated for life that it's almost statistically impossible. Like maybe it wasn't just random chance, you know?
Yeah, and he goes on to talk about objective morality, this idea that there's an inherent right and wrong that's kind of universal, that doesn't depend on your culture or upbringing. He says it's hard to explain that from a purely evolutionary perspective.
Okay, but then he goes from the cosmos to climate change. He called the whole climate change agenda a hoax. But, and this is important, he says we got to separate what we're actually observing with the planet warming from, all the proposed solutions, which are often super expensive and, maybe not even going to work.
It's almost like he's saying, okay, yeah, the planet's getting warmer, but are the things we're doing actually going to fix it? And are they worth the cost? He brings up that whole thing in the 1970s when everyone is freaking out about global cooling, a few years of colder temperatures, and some scientists were convinced we were headed for another ice age. Can you imagine?
Could you imagine trying to explain to people now that bell bottoms were also contributing to, the impending ice age? But I get his point, though. We tend to focus on these recent trends and forget that the Earth has gone through these crazy cycles forever. And that's what some people are skeptical.
Exactly. And he uses some pretty specific examples, too. He talks about those CO2 pipelines they're building to capture carbon dioxide and store it underground. And he points out, the irony of it all. We're so worried about CO2 emissions, and yet we're building these pipelines to transport concentrated CO2 through populated areas. What if there's a leak, And
what about ESG investing? That's all about, ethical, sustainable business, right? But he argues that it might actually benefit, say, China more than the U.S. He points to all these companies who are pushing for stricter emission standards here in the U.S. while also investing heavily in companies overseas that they don't have to follow those same standards. It makes you wonder, are we actually helping the planet or are we just shifting things around?
It's a good point. It's he's pushing us to look beyond those feel-good slogans and really think about the potential consequences, even if they're unintended.
It's a good reminder to never just take things at face value. And keep asking questions, even about things that seem like, settled science. So we talked about God, we talked about climate change, and if those topics didn't already make for some lively debates, just wait. Ramaswamy dives head first into some even more controversial stuff. Gender, family structures, race, the things you're not supposed to talk about.
Yeah, he really doesn't shy away, does he? It's he's intentionally picking those hot button issues that everyone tries to avoid.
Right. And this is where things get really interesting, I think, because you see him wrestling with these big questions about individual freedom versus societal expectations. You know what I mean?
Totally. And it's a conversation that's happening everywhere right now.
Yeah, exactly. So he comes right out and says, there are two genders, which obviously is going to rub some people the wrong way.
And you got to remember, he's coming at this from a very specific perspective, a biological one. Like, he's saying that sex is binary, it's determined at birth, end of story.
Right, and that kind of clashes with the way a lot of people are thinking about gender now, right? Like, there's a lot more fluidity in how people identify and express themselves.
Absolutely. And I think that's what makes this conversation so tricky. Because you have people's lived experiences, which are real and valid, and then you have these more traditional views about, like, biology and, what makes a man and a woman a woman.
And Ramaswamy doesn't back down from that, but he does. He tells this story about how he was on the campaign trail and met this journalist who identifies as non-binary. And instead of, like, shutting down the conversation, he actually listened to her, like, really engaged with her perspective, even though he ultimately disagreed.
That's important, though, isn't it? Being able to, like, have those difficult conversations with people you don't agree with. I mean, that's how we learn and grow, right?
Totally. Okay, so then he goes on to family structure. And get this. He calls his chapter, "The Nuclear Family is the Greatest Form of Governance."
Wow. Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So he's basically arguing that traditional two-parent married family structure, he's saying it's not just good for kids. It's actually, like, the best way to run a society.
Yeah.
He thinks it creates a stronger social fabric, makes people more self-reliant, and reduces the need for government handouts.
Interesting. So less big brother, more like mom and dad are keeping things in line. I can see how that would appeal to some people, especially those who are wary of government overreach. But what about those who, don't fit into that nuclear mold? Single parents, same-sex couples. How does he address that?
He does acknowledge that, not every family looks like that and that there are always exceptions. But he seems to be saying that ideally that traditional family structure is the most beneficial for society as a whole. And he points to all this research showing that kids from two-parent households tend to do better.
Right. Like, statistically speaking, they're more likely to graduate high school, go to college, get better jobs, that kind of thing.
Exactly. But it makes you wonder, though, right? Like, is it really that simple?
It's complicated, for sure. And then, of course, we get to race, which is always a tough one.
Yeah, he calls his chapter "The Truth About Race." And he doesn't hold back. He says that a lot of those anti-racist policies are actually doing more harm than good.
Yeah.
Like, they're creating more division, more resentment, instead of bringing people together.
He's definitely poking the bear with that one. I mean, these are issues that have been debated for decades, and there are strong feelings on all sides. But it sounds like he's challenging some of the more conventional thinking around race and equality.
He does. He tells this story about a teacher, Tyler Lynn, who was denied a reimbursement for something just because of his race. Like, they literally told him he couldn't get the money because he was white.
Wow. Okay, that's really making a point. Like, reverse discrimination, is that what he's getting at?
Yeah, and he argues that this kind of thing, even if it's coming from a good place, trying to right past wrongs, it actually ends up creating more division, more resentment.
It's like that whole two wrongs don't make a right thing. I mean, I get it. We need to acknowledge and address the systemic racism that exists. But how do you do that without creating new forms of inequality in the process?
Right, and that's what he's trying to figure out. He really digs into things like affirmative action and reparations. He presents both sides of the argument and then kind of leaves it up to the reader to decide. He's basically saying, hey, this is a complicated issue and there are no easy answers. Okay, so buckle up, because things are out to get, well, a little weird. We've talked God, climate change, gender, race. But Ramaswamy doesn't stop there. He goes full on into what some might call conspiracy theory territory. And look, I get it. It's easy to dismiss that stuff, right? But he makes a good point about, like, questioning everything, even, or maybe especially when it comes to these big historical events.
He's basically saying, don't just take my word for it, or the government's or anyone's. Go do your own research.
Exactly. So he starts with 9/11. And obviously, this is a really sensitive topic. We all remember where we were, the images, the whole thing. But he throws out some stuff about potential Saudi Arabian involvement that, honestly, I'd never heard before. Like, he talks about this guy, Omar al-Bayoumi, who was, get this, friends with two of the hijackers.
Here in the U.S.
Yep, here in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
And apparently, there are all these questions about his ties to the Saudi government that were never really answered.
So he's suggesting a cover-up.
He doesn't say that outright, but he points out how, like, even bringing up these questions about 9/11, it's almost taboo. Like, he got slammed by the Wall Street Journal just for saying we need more transparency.
Really? Wow. Well, that's interesting because it makes you wonder, what are they so afraid of?
Right. It kind of makes you want to dig even deeper. And this whole thing ties into what he says about COVID-19 and, like, the origins of the virus. Remember how quickly that whole lab leak theory was dismissed?
Oh, yeah. It was like you were crazy for even suggesting it.
Exactly. And now it's like, well, maybe it wasn't so crazy after all.
But it's like how much of what we believe is shaped by like the media, the government, these narratives that are being pushed.
Right. Okay, and then he gets into January 6th. And again, this is another one of those like supercharged topics.
Or everyone's already picked their side.
Yeah, exactly. But he's like, hold on, let's actually look at what happened. And he brings up some evidence that maybe the FBI knew more about the potential for violence that day than they initially let on.
Interesting. So like they downplayed it.
Potentially. And then there's that whole thing about, like, were some people actually encouraged or even entrapped by, like, informants to do things they wouldn't have otherwise done?
Man, that's getting into some like deep state conspiracy stuff right there. But again, It's like if you only listen to one side, you're never getting the full story.
Exactly. And he ties this all back to free speech, which he sees as, like, the most important thing for a functioning democracy. Because if you can't question things, if you can't challenge the official narrative, then, what are we even doing?
Yeah, that's a scary thought.
So there you have it. Nation of Truths by Vivek Ramaswamy. Definitely thought-provoking, definitely controversial, maybe a little bit crazy-making at times.
It's a wild ride, for sure.
But it makes you think, right? And isn't that what we're all here for? To engage with these big ideas, even if they make us a little uncomfortable sometimes.
Absolutely. It's good to question things, challenge our assumptions. That's how we learn and grow.
Couldn't say it better myself. So keep thinking critically, keep asking those tough questions, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.